My name is Ian Brown. I'm a junior here at Hillsdale College. I'm from Omaha, Nebraska, and I'm a history major, a Spanish minor here. Thank you. Either way, it's my honor this evening to introduce Mr. Fergus M. Bordewich. He is actually a journalist and a historian. He earns degrees from the City College of New York and Columbia University. He has served as chairman of the awards committee for the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, given by the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. He has written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Smithsonian, American Heritage, Harper's, and Reader's Digest. He is the author of several books, including Washington, The Making of the American Capitol, America's Great Debate, Henry Clay, Stephen A. Douglas, and the Compromise That Preserved the Union, and The First Congress, How James Madison, George Washington, and a group of extraordinary men invented the government. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Fergus Bordewich.
Good evening, everybody. I assume you can hear me clearly. Good. First, let me say it's a great pleasure to be here. I've known about this institution for many years, and it was I was thrilled to be invited to come here and speak to you, and also to finally get a look at this part of Michigan, because in fact, without having been here, I wrote a bit about it in an earlier book. That was a history of the Underground Railroad, which, as some of you perhaps know, was fairly thick on the ground in this area. And I also want to thank Doug Jeffrey and President Larry Arnn for extending the invitation. And I think some of the things you're going to hear me say about scandals in the founding era may surprise you, or not. But before I delve into the real subject of this lecture, I want to set the scene for you, because the United States in the 1790s was very different from the country we know today. It was small, frail, it was underpopulated, and it was a far cry from the muscular superpower that we all take for granted. Settlement extended only from the Atlantic coast to the wilderness of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio. Philadelphia, the largest city, had a population of just 45,000 people, which is almost precisely the size of Hillsdale County today. New York, the nation's capital for the first years of the decade, had only a population of 30,000. And that city, where much of what I'll be talking about took place, extended only a few blocks north of Wall Street. Most of Manhattan Island, try to picture this, was a bucolic countryside of farms, orchards, craggy hills, and dirt roads. And the site of our present capital, Washington, D.C., which will figure prominently in my talk, was rolling farmland occupied by a few plantations that depended on slave labor. With native industry in its infancy, Americans imported from Europe everything from shoe buckles and spurs and paint and fishing hooks, buttons, toothbrushes, and not to mention luxury items. It took 3 days to travel the 100 miles from Philadelphia to the future site of Washington on roads that were so afflicted with stumps and ruts that it was customary for drivers to call to their passengers to act as ballast by first leaning from one side and then to the other to keep the coach from overturning. And a crazy quilt of state jurisdictions maddeningly complicated travel. For instance, when Thomas Jefferson journeyed from Richmond to New York in 1790 to take up his duties as Secretary of State, he had to juggle 4 different state currencies. Those of Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New York, all at discounts, to pay his expenses along the way. Because of stringent property qualifications, which varied from state to state, only a very small percentage of the country's 4 million inhabitants had any role in political life. Just under 700,000 were slaves, who of course had no rights to liberty or property at all. And Americans had only barely begun to think of themselves as a single people. Our present Confederacy is not very unlike the monster of Nebuchadnezzar, which was composed of brass, clay, and iron. It's neither completely national, federal, nor sovereign, complained William Tudor, who was a friend of Vice President John Adams. Southerners distrusted New Englanders. New Englanders distrusted just about everyone. Southerners distrusted Pennsylvanians. One Pennsylvania representative remarked that he had less feeling for anything going on in New York than for the transactions in Grand Cairo. The New Yorkers and I are on an equal footing, mutual civility without a grain of good liking between us. So think of this when you imagine the early republic as kind of a hug fest with everybody getting along wonderfully together. Men such as James Madison, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, among the many of the less renowned founders, had great hope for the new system of government, what Patrick Henry called this crazy machine. Patrick Henry, by the way, hated the new government. He hated the Constitution, but reconciled himself to it grudgingly. But this new system of government that had been crafted by the Constitutional Convention, but they also worried that it simply might not work and that it could come crashing down at any time. A great deal remained unresolved. Would the checks and balances really work? Who had the authority to interpret the Constitution? Would the northern states help defend the southern against a slave uprising? Would the South come to the aid of the North in the event of a foreign invasion? James Madison nervously remarked in 1789, "We are in a wilderness without a single footstep to guide us." So it's against this backdrop that the stories I'm going to tell you unfolded. So try to imagine this. The President of the United States simultaneously holds the nation's highest executive office and the chairmanship of a private corporation that's engaged in raising investment for a massive development project that would increase the value of his own property many times over. Now, I'm talking, of course, about George Washington. Into the early months of his presidency, he continued to lead the Potomac Company, which had been organized for the commercial development of the Potomac River, with a view to making it into the country's main thoroughfare into the West Country, to the interior of North America. Its development would also dramatically increase the value of Washington's vast land holdings in western Pennsylvania and present-day West Virginia. But in 1789, hardly anyone batted an eye. Not so much because Washington was beyond reproach, though he pretty much was, but because what we call conflict of interest was rarely perceived as politically scandalous in the early days of the Republic. Washington wasn't alone. Most of the government's leading men held potentially very lucrative investments that would benefit from legislation they actively and often openly promoted. So then, just what's a scandal? At least in 1790. Is something a scandal because the behavior involved is inherently illegal, immoral, unethical, or unseemly by today's standards or by our ancestors' standards? This brief look at what scandalized our forebears of the 1790s will show us something about how our notion of what constitutes a public or a political scandal has changed, and why what shocks us today may have shocked almost no one then. And, by the same token, why much of what scandalized them means little to us now. There's no better place to begin than the machinations that surrounded the establishment of the national capital, or as it was then called, the Federal City. Many different sites, more than 30, were under consideration from Kingston, New York to Norfolk, Virginia. But the main contenders were New York City, the home of the federal government at the time, several sites in Pennsylvania, and on the Potomac. Regional advocates lobbied ferociously for their favorite locations. Among these, the boldest example was Pennsylvania Senator Robert Morris, who bought up land at every proposed site near Philadelphia and battled hard to place the capital on any one of them. His fellow senator from Pennsylvania, William Maclay, the two hated each other, by the way, William Maclay worked equally hard to win the capital for a site on the Susquehanna River, where he and his political allies owned land. After a sequence of horse-trading backroom deals, so many of them that I wouldn't dare begin to recount them for you, Congress finally settled on the Potomac. But where on the Potomac? Congress deputed George Washington to pick the best spot. It was generally expected that he would select a site far upriver, where Maryland is narrowest, so that the federal district might eventually encompass parts of 3 states, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. Instead, he insisted on the present site, most of which lay outside the zone mandated by Congress, and required Congress to vote again to enlarge that zone to accommodate him. The site he chose, as we all know, lies conveniently across the river from his property at Mount Vernon. After Washington's death, John Adams tartly declared that the deal raised the value of Washington's properties 1,000%. The president also raised the rents on his lands in the area as soon as Congress approved the site. He then named 3 of his friends, all principals of the Potomac Company, as commissioners to manage the development of the capital. Now, in today's terms, Washington's actions obviously represented a gross conflict of interest, but no one even suggested censoring him. Nothing he did was illegal at the time, nor did any congressional committees exist to investigate it, even if it had been. In this, Washington was very much a man of his times. By the same token, at least dozens of members of Congress were simultaneously speculating in the radically discounted scrip that Revolutionary War veterans had been issued in lieu of pay, knowing that it would dramatically spike in value when Alexander Hamilton's financial plan for redeeming the national and state debts went into effect. Deals of this sort made many of them rich. In short, commercial self-interest among public officials was pretty much taken for granted. But then we come to the creation of the federal city itself, and there's quite a different story to be told. The national government appropriated no money to build the Capitol, the president's mansion, or anything else. Instead, a fast-talking young financier named Samuel Blodgett, who had served as an aide to Washington during the war, convinced the president and the commissioners that he could raise all the money that was needed. He offered to put together a $500,000 loan from private investors, promising to deliver the money to the commissioners in regular installments. The commissioners would in return, pledge city lots as security. Blodgett assured them that massive investment would drive up the value of the lots by 40%. Essentially, Blodgett played Washington, Jefferson, and the commissioners like a pitchman hustling a crowd of hayseeds at a country fair. Meanwhile, New York's embryonic and unregulated financial market was in the throes of what contemporaries called bankomania, a hurricane of speculation in government bonds that prompted the overnight establishment of flimsily financed and unstable banks. This bubble, Alexander Hamilton later reported, was in fact artificial and violent, such as no discrete calculation of probabilities could have supposed. The master manipulator at the eye of this hurricane was William Dewar, Hamilton's former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, who exploited insider information gained from his position in an attempt to corner the New York bond market. Cornered by creditors, he was reduced to borrowing not just from banks and fellow financiers, but from shopkeepers, widows, and even one of the city's better-known madams. He failed. In March 1792, Dewar's collapse brought on the nation's first Wall Street crash, bankrupting many of the city's biggest moneymen, including James Wilson, a justice of the Supreme Court, who was imprisoned for debt as a result of failed speculations and spent the rest of his life running from creditors. Dewar himself was financially ruined, almost lynched, and jailed in debtor's prison from which he never emerged. The cash reserves of the Bank of the United States plummeted by 34%, prompting the bank to call in a quarter of its outstanding loans. Now, bad as this was, it would have been a great deal worse without quick work by Alexander Hamilton, who acted to stabilize the securities market and staved off a full-scale recession. Interest rates soared to a ruinous 1% a day. Hamilton wrote, "'Tis time there must be a line of separation between honest men and knaves, between respectable stockholders and dealers in the funds, and more unprincipled gamblers." Now, Americans would still be saying much the same thing 2 centuries later. Meanwhile, back on the Potomac, the money upon which Samuel Blodgett, you remember him, Samuel Blodgett, along with the president, the commissioners, and Congress, had pinned their hopes upon, evaporated into thin air. Scarcely anyone was interested in buying land in the federal district, and of those who did, many refused to pay. The only real winner was Blodgett himself, who acquired at a secretly discounted price the most valuable piece of real estate on offer. Since land sales seemed unpromising, Blodgett proposed another scheme, raising money through a lottery with $350,000 in prizes, including a non-existent hotel. It's true, I kid you not. Once again, Blodgett succeeded in gulling the commissioners, as well as Washington and Jefferson. When this too failed to generate any income, the commissioners finally begged Blodgett to stop the business as soon as possible. By 1793, construction of the government buildings had almost completely stalled. The federal city looked set to become a spectacular national failure with serious consequences for the frail young republic. If the buildings were not completed at the end of the 10-year deadline set by Congress, that's November 1800, the capital would remain, very likely permanently, in Philadelphia. At this dire moment, 3 new financiers with impeccable credentials rode to the rescue. James Greenleaf of Boston, who had made a fortune in land speculation, John Nicholson, Pennsylvania's respected Comptroller General, and U.S. Senator Robert Morris, who, having failed to win the capital for Pennsylvania, now staked his fortune and reputation on cornering the real estate in the federal district. They bought out Blodgett and promised to succeed where he had failed. The economic historian A.M. Sokolsky, writing in the 1930s, would call them the greatest land-grabbing triumvirate that ever operated in America. The partners contracted with the commissioners to buy thousands of lots in the federal city for over $1 million. They committed themselves to erect a house on every third lot and to paying the commissioners annual installments over the next 7 years until the project was completed. In all, they controlled 42% of the available real estate in the district. To pay for it, they would float a $1.2 million loan, a stupendous sum at the time from lenders in Europe. So, from here on, the capital's fate essentially became the prisoner of a speculative scheme so gargantuan and tangled that it still defies attempts to fully unravel it. Essentially, the 3 partners created a pyramid scheme. Its collapse literally shook the capital to its already shaky foundations. First, because of political instability in Europe, the partners were unable to raise more than a fraction of the loans they sought. Second, the largest portion of their collateral lay in 2.3 million acres of unsurveyed and unsaleable land in Georgia, mired in clouded claims, burdened with unpaid taxes, occupied by very combative squatters, and already encumbered for debt. In short, No one wanted it, and they couldn't get rid of it. Within a few years, the trio's wealth disappeared into financial quicksand. By now, the partners owed the commissioners tens of thousands of dollars that they couldn't pay, along with a contractual obligation to build hundreds of houses that they couldn't afford to build. For the next 2 years, they were like aerialists, tightrope walkers, seemingly suspended in the air with their legs churning, spinning over the heads of their audience of creditors, public officials, and prospective investors, struggling to pull off one new financial trick that would keep them solvent. Instead, they came down in a heap. Broke, plagued by lawsuits, Morris became a virtual prisoner in his Philadelphia home. Nicholson was reduced to looting a Presbyterian widows' fund, of which he was a trustee, and attempting to lease a hotel in the federal city for a brothel. In 1798, their luck ran out. Both Nicholson and Morris wound up in debtor's prison in Philadelphia, virtually penniless and their reputations in ruins. Morris remained there 3.5 years. He came out a broken man and died 5 years later in near oblivion, virtually erased from the pantheon of the nation's founders. Nicholson died in prison, leaving a wife, 8 children, and $12 million in debt. Greenleaf, the slickest of the three, spent less than a year in jail. The collapse of the speculative bubble brought land sales and construction in the federal city almost to a halt. Thousands of the best lots were encumbered by liens and litigation. Would-be investors regarded the place as a failure. In the end, grudging appropriations by Congress and the state of Maryland provided enough money for the government buildings to be completed by the 1800 deadline, but just barely. You could still smell the paint inside the walls of the Capitol building as Congress arrived. It would be generations before Washington grew into anything like the grand national capital that the founders had imagined. So I ask, what was the difference between George Washington's transparent conflicts of interest and Robert Morris's speculations? Now, a cynic might say merely that one man's schemes succeeded and the others failed, and that winners don't have to justify themselves. Of course, gratitude to Washington as the paramount hero of the Revolutionary War meant that, in fact, he could do almost no wrong in the public eye, at least in the early days of his presidency. Even John Adams regarded his transgressions, if that's what they were, as unseemly rather than illicit. Even Morris and Nicholson, like Dewar before them, were not prosecuted for fraud or insider trading. They were jailed for indebtedness. Now, honor is a word rarely heard in public life in our own day, but it was a quality that men of the 18th century rated among the most sterling and essential of human virtues. A man's honor could be breached or enhanced in many ways, but one of the surest ways to lose it, to become dishonored, was to fall into debt, which entailed the betrayal of one's creditors. And we should bear in mind that many innocent people were ruined financially as a result of these speculators' schemes. I'll mention again that in 1796, James Wilson, member of the Supreme Court, was twice imprisoned for debt. Up to now, I've been talking only about financial misbehavior. But what about the more personal kinds of scandal, misdeeds of the boudoir, so to speak, or in plain language, sex scandals, that loom so large in our own time, entangling so many politicians? In the early national era, Americans sometimes seemed quite puritanical, but not always in predictable ways. In 1789, the French ambassador scandalized New York society by living openly with a woman who was not his wife. But the living arrangements of the apparently homosexual Peter L'Enfant, the designer of Washington, D.C., caused no recorded comment at all. I suspect that in many such cases, a tacit don't ask, don't tell policy was practiced. And then there was Alexander Hamilton. In 1791, 23-year-old Maria Reynolds approached Treasury Secretary Hamilton, then 34 years old and married, and asked him for help and money, saying that her husband, James Reynolds, a minor government official and speculator, had abandoned her and that she was in desperate straits. Hamilton went to her boarding house where, he later wrote, "It was quickly apparent that other than pecuniary consolation would be acceptable." The clandestine affair that ensued went on for at least a year. This arrangement quickly evolved into a con on the part of the Reynoldses. James Reynolds was aware of the affair, possibly from the start, and encouraged it in order to blackmail Hamilton. Reynolds wrote to him in January 1792, "I have not the least objection to your calling, as a friend to both of us. I rely on your befriending me if there should be anything to offer that would be to my advantage." In all, Reynolds extorted at least $1,300 from Hamilton. Later in 1792, Reynolds was jailed on fraud charges stemming from an attempt to misuse funds intended for Revolutionary War veterans. He then used knowledge of his wife's affair in an effort to extricate himself from prison. He revealed the affair to Senator James Monroe and others in Congress, who accused Hamilton of corruption, believing that he must have paid off Reynolds with money from the Treasury. This was not, in fact, the case. Hamilton had paid the blackmail with his own money. His accusers accepted his denial and the business was hushed up. However, Monroe sent incriminating copies of the letters between Reynolds and Hamilton to his close ally and Hamilton's archenemy, Thomas Jefferson. 5 years later, in 1797, James Callender, at that time a propagandist for Jefferson, made the affair public in a pamphlet. Hamilton angrily confronted Monroe for betraying him. Words were exchanged. Each called the other a scoundrel and a liar. A duel between the two was only narrowly averted through the efforts of none other than Aaron Burr, who, of course, would himself kill Hamilton in a duel in 1804. Can't make it up. By this time, the Reynolds affair was public knowledge, a major embarrassment to Hamilton, and one of several factors that denied him any further role in public office. He published a 95-page pamphlet in his defense, in which he admitted to the affair in great detail, apologized for it, and once again denied that he had done anything corrupt in his role as Treasury Secretary. Although Hamilton remained high in the esteem of George Washington, his reputation was permanently tarnished. Less, however, for his sexual improprieties than for succumbing to bribery and for his concealment of it, which fed into a wide perception among Jeffersonian Democrats and some of his fellow Federalists that Hamilton was a man who just couldn't be trusted. The propagandist James Callender was also a pivotal figure in what today is doubtless the most famous scandal of the era. After 2 centuries of denial by Thomas Jefferson's white descendants, virtually all historians now accept that he kept an enslaved Negro concubine with whom he had sexual relations for decades and produced several children. Salacious allusions to Dusky Sally were part and parcel of what might be termed America's first golden age of scandalmongering. They were a coda to the fiercely contested election of 1800, which was one of the dirtiest in American history right up to our own time. And I think a case could be made that it was by far the dirtiest, frankly. That election represented the first handover of power from one hostile political party to another, from Federalists to Democratic Republicans, an unprecedented experience that encouraged candidates to demonize the opposition as satanic threats rather than to regard them as worthy and principled competitors. Sound familiar? If you think that today's press, by the way, is too partisan, you should read the newspapers of the 1800s, the Aurora, for example, when there was no such thing as fair and balanced coverage of anything. Jefferson's Republicans, Democrat Republicans formerly, accused Federalist Adams of insanity, senility, plotting to establish a monarchy, hatred of the people, collusion with Britain against American interests, and of having a hideous hermaphroditical character. Take that. The Federalists accused Jefferson of having cheated his law clients, showing cowardice in the face of the enemy during the Revolution, atheism, and being head of the French party in America. One partisan journalist predicted that if Jefferson were to be elected, licentiousness and immorality would meet with the most public approbation. Every restraint would soon be thrown off, and men would soon bring themselves to be infamous debauchees, assassins, cheats, thieves, liars, hateful and hating one another, a curse upon the earth. 1800, right? So, the accusation against Jefferson of miscegenation was thus but one scurrilous charge among many. There had been rumors for some time that Jefferson was carrying on a liaison with an enslaved woman. Then, in 1802, the hints became explicit when the pamphleteer, James Callender, now a renegade former supporter of Jefferson, wrote in the Richmond Recorder, "It is well known that the man whom it delighteth the people to honor keeps, and for many years past has kept, as his concubine, one of his own slaves. Her name is Sally." That's boldface, all caps. Callender asserted that had this come out during the presidential campaign, the establishment of this single fact would have rendered his election impossible. Callender clearly was implying that this fact was sufficiently scandalous, in rather the terms in which we use that word, to prevent Jefferson from having been elected. But in short, party loyalties then, too, defined the fault lines of outrage, much as Richard Goodwin this afternoon suggested they do today. The outcome, had this fact been, had Callender written his article before the election, the outcome is unknowable today. But it's clear that in the early republic, many, perhaps most Americans, were on the whole fairly tolerant of the vagaries of human nature. Public men generally were seen as fallible, whether in the pursuit of either speculative riches or of dusky maidens in relationships that transgressed the nominal boundaries of polite society. As Annette Gordon-Reed has pointed out in her masterful examination of the Hemings-Jefferson relationship, their liaison was apparently not all that unusual for the time and place. Scandal, as the rest of this conference will make clear, has a history of its own. It evolves and it changes. Today, there's nothing scandalous about indebtedness. Virtually all Americans now live with a degree of debt that would mortify our 18th century ancestors. And while personal bankruptcy may be embarrassing, it rarely causes a major scandal. Moreover, in the early republic, what was a scandal in one part of the country may not have been in another. The revelation of Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings probably shocked straight-laced Federalist New Englanders, for example, more than it did men in the slave states, where such relationships were all too common, if not often spoken of in polite society. And few Americans today would consider a biracial relationship as scandalous. On the other hand, in this era of the Me Too movement, Jefferson's reputation would doubtless be destroyed in the press and public opinion for what would be deemed prolonged sexual abuse within a power relationship. So, if there's a lesson to be drawn from this brief tour of the 1790s, it's that scandal, at least historically speaking, is often in the eye of the beholder. Is a scandal really a scandal if no one takes notice, such as George Washington's self-dealing over the site of the nation's capital? Today, it would surely be cause for impeachment. while the indebtedness of Robert Morris or William Dewar would hardly condemn them to prison. On the other hand, Dewar's insider trading certainly would send him to the clink today, though it was not a crime in 1792. So it should be said that none of these scandals, or dare I say non-scandals in many cases, threatened the survival of the government, which at the start of the decade had seemed so very fragile. Partly that was because popular opinion mattered far less than it does today, because relatively so few people could vote. It was also because, by and large, Americans trusted their leaders, flawed and human though they revealed themselves to be. They also trusted their new institutions to survive, and that if those institutions broke, then they would fix them as they saw fit. As Representative George Thatcher of Massachusetts put it in 1792, politics are the meat and drink of the people in a free government, and if it does not suit us, faith, we will correct the cook. And I personally find that a remark that we should all know and might well remember, because he's talking about what democracy does best, which is fix itself. And to conclude, I'll say, while we ought to pause before judging the behavior of our forebears by today's values, usually a mistake, we have every reason to be grateful to the subsequent generations of jurists, crusading journalists, and ordinary citizens for insisting on standards of probity and decency that few Americans in the 1790s could dream of. Thank you. Be very happy to take questions. I want to make one parenthetical remark here, because as I was speaking, I fear that many of you listening to me think, that guy was really down on George Washington. You know, I've written extensively about Washington in 2 books, and the more I've written about the man, the more I admire him, and the more I appreciate his uniqueness, his unique importance to the nation. At that time and place. No other individual who was available could possibly have filled the presidency the way he did. He was a superb president. He was a superb judge of men, one of his greatest strengths. And in ways that mattered to the people of his own day, his personal probity was unimpeachable. I've given you a sidelight because that didn't bother his contemporaries all that much, except for the generally rather apoplectic John Adams, precisely because it contrasts values of that time with our own. Please don't feel that I'm being unduly hard on George. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bordewich has graciously agreed to sign copies of his book, The First Congress, outside in the Cyril lobby directly following the lecture. We now have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you.
Washington also have quite a few sexual relationships with his slaves?
There's no evidence whatsoever of that.
Okay, I remember hearing some history
No,
class. Okay, so it's good to know. Sorry? Oh, I'm sorry.
Maybe do you want to say?
I just
say it louder.
I remember hearing in history classes as a child that George Washington had quite a few children, none of which were born by Martha. So that's not true.
There's no evidence whatsoever
Okay.
that that was the case.
That's good to know.
And whether or not he ever did, I can't say. Nobody knows.
That's different than knowing that he did. So thank you for clearing that up.
There's no documentation for that whatsoever.
Thanks.
Thank you again for coming and speaking tonight. One of the things that's really popular with people my age today, both at Hillsdale and out in the big world, is Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical Hamilton, which addresses a lot of these scandalous issues, including D.C., and obviously Hamilton's scandal with Maria Reynolds. And I was wondering, what was your, if you've looked at that at all or heard about it, how did you think that Mr. Miranda did in addressing those issues?
Okay, I mean, it's a great question, and that musical, which I did have which I did see in San Francisco where I live, and I had the privilege of meeting Lin-Manuel Miranda in Washington at one point as well and talked to him. I liked it a lot more than I thought. I did not expect to like it for reasons that aren't important, but I liked it, not because it's great history, because it's an artist's rendering of history, because it's an incredibly creative piece of work. And he does things with music that I don't really care for very much, that I found interesting. And also because it has turbocharged the interest of so many, not just young people, but Americans in that era. And it's turned Hamilton literally into a rock star. Is it history? Well, only sorta. Sorta. It's art. It's art. An artist can do whatever he wants. He can make up anything he wants. And it's remarkable that Lin-Manuel Miranda did as much research as he did, and there's as much history in it as there is. And that Ron Chernow, he apparently was reading Ron Chernow's book on the beach on Long Island and was just swept away by it. Ron Chernow's biography of Hamilton, those who haven't read it, is superb, wonderful book, as is Chernow's biography of Grant, very recent, highly recommended. And Chernow sometimes does programs with Miranda, and that's really the imprimatur, an historian's imprimatur. The show made more of the relationship between Burr and Hamilton that was really there, and of course, obviously, it made more of romance than was maybe really figured in Hamilton's actual historical experience. But to take some of these financial problems that Hamilton was wrestling with and turn it into rap music, geez, brilliant. It's brilliant.
Hi, Jerry Casey. Why do you think that nothing relative to Franklin Roosevelt, relative to perhaps Missy LeHand or Mercer in the modern age, and John Kennedy in the age, why were they, and why was it not until Hart and that era that those aspects of the private lives, not of Johnson, not of the others, had come forward? What changed?
Well, that's a pretty interesting question, actually. And certainly there were presidents between Jefferson and Roosevelt who were accused of salacious behavior. Grover Cleveland, famous cartoon during Grover Cleveland's campaign for the presidency of a little baby saying, "Where's my pa?" Harding was pretty notorious, and others as well. But your question is a good one because something did change, and by and large, I think the explanation, without getting really deep in the weeds on it, is that our public values, public as opposed to private, perhaps, became more and more shaped by, I think, the standards of the Victorian era, which carried well into the 20th century. Harding was obviously an exception to that, although that was a great deal of money was paid to his several mistresses so that he could be elected. Today, of course, Roosevelt's relationships would be, there were a couple of them. It was not the remotest way they could be covered up, or would anybody wish them to be, other than that we all feel kind of embarrassed by this stuff. And we'd just rather, half we'd rather not know. On the other hand, we feel, well, we'd better, And those values faded, frankly. I think that's the simple explanation. I don't think it's attributable, personally, I don't think it's attributable to party politics. Certainly the transformation of American attitudes about sex in the 60s suddenly made it freed journalists and others to start asking a lot of questions they considered extremely unseemly before that. I mean, as I'm speaking, I'm thinking of 3 or 4 or 5 other presidents of both parties, various parties, actually, whose affairs were covered up. You know, I have mixed feelings about it. As an historian, I want to know, but as a citizen, I really don't.
To the left.
There's somebody out there in Colorado who's got a question.
Over here, on the other side.
Oh, sorry.
Here, Adrie Kalesvaart from Rhode Island. You mentioned democracy kind of self-corrects. But there still has to be a principle behind it then. And I think in those days that the concept that people had a right to their own life, which is so unique American in the Declaration of Independence, was that milestone or the post to aim for. So it could self-correct because there was a principle there that man had the right to live for his own sake, which is uniquely American. We are losing it now, I think. Any thought on that? Because
yes.
there are many democracies around the world, and I wouldn't want to live in those things.
Well, you know, my response to that, because I've reflected on this, on just the question you're posing, is that I have tremendous confidence in American democracy. I have tremendous confidence in the system that the founders created. I think it's amazing that after 200 years, yes, we still say we're a new country. Well, gosh, it's 200 plus years, and it's now one of the oldest surviving consistent systems of government in the world. And they did a pretty good job. And it's remarkable that this crazy machine that, as Patrick Henry described it, confected in 17 at the Constitutional Convention, is still working. It's remarkably, has proved in a world that they couldn't really even imagine, okay? And, you know, I think much of what disheartens a lot of Americans today, is a disdain for, a disappointment in American institutions and in politics. I mean, politics, frankly, one can hear it anywhere, is often used as sort of a bad word. But you know, our forebears fought the revolution to give us politics. That's what it was for. That's what they created. That's what they freed us to do. And that's why I quoted George Thatcher there, because I liked his way of expressing it. And I think if we're patriots, it's our business to retain confidence in the institutions that they created. I mean the institutions across the board, including ones that are under attack. I mean, I will say I've lived in Washington, D.C., and you may be shocked to hear this. I have a higher regard for most people in politics than a great many people do. I've met a lot of people. I've never been in politics, but I like being a fly on the wall as a journalist and as a primarily an historian. And I mean, our parties are filled with people, self-sacrificing people, believe it or not. Not everybody's lining his pockets. And people with views very different from my own, I've come to admire for their commitment to American democracy and to the Republican form of government. So I am upbeat and I am optimistic I do not feel defeated or hopeless about American politics today. That's my speech.
Yes, I want to thank you very much. I found your talk very interesting. Now, scandals of the past didn't have Facebook, didn't have CNN, didn't have the rapid one after another until you're blue in the face, as we do today. And I'm finding that I'm beginning to care less and less. This latest one on CBS, the president, CEO, being fired, I'm more concerned that he's getting $100 million, possibly, than I am about the 9 women. And I'm angry about that because it's making women look pathetic, like we can't say no. And so I wanted just your opinion on that.
Well said, but you know, in a certain way, yeah, you're absolutely right that today's technological media magnify scandals and virtually any other factoid or fantasy to a degree that numbs us all. But in 1800, that's what the tabloid, the forerunners of the tabloid press did. There weren't tabloids literally at the time, but there was a huge burgeoning of newspapers in the United States in the 1790s as Americans became. That was akin to Americans a couple of decades ago suddenly getting hooked on 24-hour cable news TV. Americans devoured newspapers, they devoured partisan news, and yeah, it's different, but in certain ways it's not that different.
My name is Jolene Estru. Thank you so much, Mr. Bordewich, for your talk this evening. It was very informative. I'm wondering, part of the continuing scandal from the founding era that remains today is the question of how do we understand the phrase in the Declaration of Independence penned by our founding fathers that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, so on and so forth, especially in light of our founding fathers' position and personal practices when it relates to the issue of slavery. And today we would consider that to be extremely scandalous, whereas at that time it may not have been. Can you further shed light on this issue?
Yeah, well, it's, I appreciate that question. I've written a great deal on the history of slavery. And one of my earlier books actually was specifically about the politics of slavery and the creation of Washington, D.C. And another part of the story, which I didn't talk about tonight, was precisely that. That was behind a lot of those negotiations, those backroom negotiations about where the capital was going to go. And southern states in 1789 and 90 talked about seceding if the capital was placed in a northern free state. So the crisis of slavery, and it was an ongoing crisis right up till 1865, was fundamental from the beginning. And abolitionism, I'm well aware that this school was founded by abolitionists, and I think that's a tremendous thing to be proud of. There's a very, very small number of colleges in the United States that can claim that. Abolitionism as a movement, as the kind of radical movement that really began to pound slavery, didn't develop until the 1830s, as you probably know. It was widely believed in 1790 or there, in the founding era, that slavery was going to wither on its own. It was going to go away. It was going to disappear naturally. So those who opposed slavery or found it repugnant, shameful, scandalous, were willing to bide their time. It proved to be wrong. It didn't wither away. It metastasized, and there were 700,000 enslaved people in 1790. There were 4 million in 1861. The opposite happened, and slavery became stronger and stronger and stronger politically. And I think, as an historian, it's our job it's the job of historians like me to understand our ancestors. It doesn't cost me anything to be outraged by slavery because it doesn't exist in my lifetime in my country. I've tried to understand the minds of those who defended and protected slavery as they did, who became stronger and stronger. I'm writing a book currently about the Civil War, and I've gone into that again in some depth. And I wrote a history of the Underground Railroad, as I mentioned, which I wrote a great deal about the history of slavery. And, even as an historian, it's very hard not to be shocked at thinking that was taken absolutely for granted in the founding period and right up to the Civil War in southern states, a desire to protect slavery. Even founders were ambivalent. George Washington. I think the most admirable aspects of George Washington's character was that he evolved. He evolved from a garden variety, plantation-owning, slave-owning Virginia aristocrat to a proto-abolitionist. And he ensured that every slave that he had in his own name, whom he could free, he freed on his deathbed. And he had considered, but for political reasons he decided not to speak out personally against slavery in his lifetime.
How different do you think the world would be now if that compromise had not been made? Because there probably wouldn't have been a United States of America.
The question was, how different do I think the United States would be and the world if that compromise had not been made at the Constitutional Convention? Because there would not have been a constitution without that compromise. Have I got you right? Yeah. Well, that is the big brutal question, and it is brutal. It is brutal. There's no way around that. Southern states would not have joined in signing the Constitution without that compromise. And later, during debates over petitions having to do with slavery in the first Congress, which I've written about, a South Carolina senator or representative said to Pennsylvanians, he's standing up and he says, "Well, you took us with our slaves and we took you with your Quakers." And, I think what do I think about that? How would the United States be different? Had the United States not found a formula for unifying in 1789, we would have continued to fracture. And that was perceived by all involved who were in a position to have an opinion on the matter. The United States would fracture into any number of small statelets, many of them controlled by one or another European power, allied against each other, at war with each other. Everybody saw that handwriting on the wall. And that was a great motivator towards compromise. And indeed, in the many compromises that were made in the early Republic, precisely that. And frankly, right up to the Civil War, that fear of fragmentation, which was very real, very, very real. I argue in a book I wrote about the Compromise of 1850 that had secession occurred in 1850, which was much closer than people think, there wouldn't necessarily have been a war because I don't think the North was ready to fight it, but a precedent would have been set for peaceful secession and the West Coast would have gone as well, as late as then, 1850. So I think Americans, by and large, are not very comfortable, I think, seeing a tragic dimension in this country's history, because we are accustomed to seeing our history as a steady upward trajectory, always better, always higher, principled from the beginning and more principled now. Well, maybe not at the moment, but and I think it behooves us really to incorporate a more tragic dimension in how we look at our past, because the lives of millions of enslaved people, they paid the price. They paid the price, and they had no say in the matter whatsoever. And that then you can add up in some cosmic way what the cost was there, but that's part of all our history too. And this isn't guilt mongering, but it's realism. It's a realism where this is our history, and slavery was as fundamental to it as constitutionalism. So I'm glad I didn't have to make the choice in 1787.
Please join me in thanking Mr. Bordewich.
Thank you.